A few months ago, we recorded a series of conversations with Dave Snowden and friends, and they've proved very popular, so I thought I'd get together with some more friends, and this time to talk about OODA. That's the OODA loop created by Colonel John Boyd. In creating the flow system, we decided to extend the understanding of the OODA loop by mapping it to the 3 ontological states and 4 of the 5 domains in the Cynefin sense-making framework that helps when working in complex environments. One reader of the book, and part of these conversations, Andrew Blaine, suggested we should discuss this more. The co-author and main contributor to this section in the book, Brian Ponch Rivera, is also taking part as these were his outcomes from a workshop held with Dave Snowden and others. Kim Ballastrin, who works with Andrew, is a complexity expert and joins the group along with Ben Ford and Christopher Bramley, who are well-known experts on the OODA loop. Others join us in upcoming sessions, but this is the group you will first meet. Later in the series, we will be joined by Roger Venegas, a scientist and longtime collaborator of mine, and Charlie Protzman, who has over 40 years in this industry and a family history that predates Deming and a unique connection to the birth of PDCA. Once the exploratory reaches a convergence, we'll invite Dave Snowden and other experts to review and then improve the mapping to Cynefin and other fields of understanding. A little background if you're new to the OODA loop. Colonel John Boyd developed the OODA loop more than 40 years ago by blending his experience in the cockpit with science, strategy, warfare, early complexity thinking, and lessons from the Toyota production system. Boyd developed OODA for the Air Force, where he was tasked with determining the success experienced by the F-86 pilots during the Korean War. These pilots were able to more quickly orient themselves to the tactical situation for a number of reasons. Aside from the advantages afforded by the aircraft design, the pilots were better able to act because of their abilities to make quick transitions, to change quickly and to efficiently utilize their reserves. These processes practiced in combat and emergency situations became known as the OODA loop. The observe component of the OODA loop represents assessing the environment, one's place in it, and the interaction of the two. Orientation refers to a set of filters that influence one's sense-making capabilities, culture, genetic heritage, new information, and previous experiences. The orientation involves the analysis and synthesis stage, which results in an aggregate of all the orientation components, in addition to any information obtained from the initial observation stage. The decision component results from the aggregate of the previous stages, including analysis and synthesis, resulting in a process of projection, empathy, correlation, and selection. The component of acting is a result of the decision stage in which a hypothesis is presented to be tested. That is, a hypothesis about how best to shape and be shaped by the environment. Identified as a non-linear process, the OODA loop was described by Boyd as an evolving, open-ended, far from equilibrium process of self-organization, emergence, and natural selection. The OODA loop is a continuous cycle that can begin at either of the 4 components: observe, orient, decide, act. The following is the first of a series of conversations we are holding with a group of the noted experts I mentioned in both complexity thinking and the praxis of the OODA loop. We have no idea where this will go, but the book was the starting point that prompted this series of conversations. And alas, due to my own lack of orientation, the first session was recorded in speaker view rather than in the gallery or group view, so I hope that does not detract too much from the interactions and discussions. I have corrected it in future sessions. I hope you find these enjoyable and stimulating, and we welcome all feedback. Thank you. Welcome everybody. We have gathered together today to talk about OODA loop in complexity. One of our colleagues, Mr. Blaine, up there in my top left, he may be positioned to the people watching this, had been reading this book, a book I recommend you all buy, by the way, but a book that I co-authored with Professor John Turner from the University of North Texas and one of the illustrious crew on the screen now, Brian Rivera, otherwise known as Punch. And in this book, we explored the OODA loop, the observe, orient, decide, and act loop. And when Andrew was reading the book, he pulled up a particular page in the book I bookmarked, and if you've got the book, it's page 81, where there was an exploration of different configurations of the OODA loop, depending on the domain of complexity we find ourselves in within the Cynefin model, or the Cynefin framework, I apologize, created by Dave Snowden. So there was some conversation about this on Twitter, and Andrew decided to bring together, or to suggest we get together with some people who've spent a lot of time studying the OODA loop. And this is what brings us to today. So I'm just going to ask everybody to give a very brief introduction and to explain your connection to OODA, since I've given my piece. Maybe I'll start with you, Andrew, because we're probably more moderators than experts on this topic.
Yeah, and I'll introduce, basically, really find what you're doing with it in the book quite fascinating, Nigel. I don't call myself an OODA expert by any stretch. I've watched a couple of Boyd's videos and have had a little bit of a look at it, but I realise I'm in the company of people who know far more than me. I did want to bring Chris Bramley into the conversation because Chris has a wonderful model of Cynefin that really helps me to understand the state transitions and the pathways through Cynefin, which I think will be quite interesting from for the perspective of others. And Kim's also a complexity expert. The reason I was interested to bring Kim in is because Kim uses Cynefin a lot in program planning. And what I'm interested in this conversation is, all right, so when we have the strategy cycle, so strategic intent into strategic planning, and then into decomposition of work, it seems like what Brian's done mapping OODA to Cynefin is kind of a higher order thing than what Kim does in terms of how do you look at a program of work and make sense of it with complexity. So that's the kind of stuff I'd love to get out of this conversation.
So let's jump to Christopher. So Chris, if you want to give us a brief intro of you and why you're fascinated by OODA, and then we'll pass the baton on to Kim after that.
Sure. So a lot of what I do is split really into three pieces. The kind of agile aspects and all the coaching is actually a very small part. Obviously, you know, then you've got the kind of complexity aside, especially around Cynefin. But actually, a lot of the basis of what I do is human learning and engagement. So based upon, you know, various degrees of neuroscience and, you know, also different types of neurology. I've got quite a few autistic traits and so forth. So I find it fascinating looking at how different people look at these things, because of course it's very easy for even, you know, people like us to sit down and say, well, yes, but this makes sense. And of course, some people literally think about things in a completely different way because they're hardwired in a different way. And I'm definitely one of them. Yeah, that's pretty much what I do. And in terms of kind of OODA, I guess I'm a naturalized user of it rather than somebody who sits down and kind of thinks of it. I tend to do a lot of posts around things like rock climbing, scuba diving, sometimes martial arts, all depending, stuff that I do and that I understand. So scuba diving was a very interesting one because you've got your stop, breathe, think, respond kind of stuff. So anyway, I'll stop there or I'll just keep going.
I was going to say, we can't help but notice the wall adorned with samurai swords or similar. So maybe we're getting to the fascinating discussion of how OODA figures in use of such weaponry. Kim, let's welcome you to the gang and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks. So I do a lot of principal consulting and work, particularly with federal government. So that's quite fascinating. And when I first came across the Cynefin framework, I couldn't figure out how to use it because I was used to instructional things like you put sticky notes on a wall and you can follow process and things like that. And so for the first 3 months, I was like trying to use this framework as a hammer, as a direct tool. And then I realized it wasn't that. It was a sense-making framework, and it's used for checking things. And then I went through the evangelist stage where every time I wanted to use it, I'd spend 15 minutes explaining the framework to people. And then I realized I didn't need to explain it to them. And I came up with a nice, quick classification approach based on Cynefin for sorting through how much uncertainty there was in the different parts and components of a project or a program of work. So I like taking something that is very useful and some people find a little bit hard to grasp, and using it directly to actually do something useful. So that's what I like doing.
I'm with Andrew. I think I'm in the presence of people who know far more about these things than I do. And I wrote a book on it. Good grief. Ben, let's say hello to Ben. I know he's over in the UK. Ben, tell us a little bit about your interest in this whole subject.
Hey guys, everyone, rather, sorry, not guys. So although I was in the military, I never actually heard of the OODA loop while I was in the military. It's not really penetrated the UK military, and I left nearly 20 years ago. So I came across the OODA loop probably just in cutting around Wardley maps and Cynefin and complexity. Can't remember exactly where I came across it. And I've been really, really interested in it ever since. It cuts across so many of my other interests, like Chris, I'm also a martial artist, although rather lapsed at the moment. And I think that the most amazing thing about the OODA loop to me is that, Boyd passed away in '97, and I read books about neuroscience and complexity and things that were written in the last 3 years, and it still maps really well. And I think OODA has a representation problem. I think the diagram is its biggest weakness, and I'm really interested to explore with all you lot how we might sort of change that representation to make it more accessible and more intuitive to people.
Well, and on that, we'll hop over or fly over to our aviator and my co-author and co-creator, Punch. Now, everything in the book to do with the OODA loop, Punch, came out of your crazy head. So this is where you now talk a little bit more about what you've done with the OODA loop, where it led you, and what we created in the book. And then I know we're all eager to sort of get working on a shared canvas, which I'll record on Zoom as well, so people can see our fun and games on that. But over to you, Punch.
Yeah, so background with me on the OODA loop, fighter aviation background, F-14, about 10 years of doing that. I came across the Cynefin Framework in about 2006, I think it was. We had his Secretary of Defense named Donald Rumsfeld start talking about known knowns and unknown unknowns to us down at the Air Force Command Staff College down in Montgomery, Alabama. I didn't know I was flying the OODA loop, and I didn't know that was the Cynefin Framework. And I also came across some sense maker work in East Africa. Again, all happy accidents, didn't do anything about it back then. And it wasn't until about 3 years ago, after the accidents at sea, we had the USS John McCain and the USS Fitzgerald accidents in 2017. I actually departed consulting, went back in the Navy, did some work there, and got pulled into the Naval Safety Center after I did some work for the bigger Navy. And one of the things we were doing, and this leads into what you see in the book, one of the things we were doing is we were talking about breaking down accidents inside the US Navy, and we were talking about parachutists at the time. And we broke it down to the point where it fit into the Cynefin Framework, and that's the OODA loop that you have in there now. So that's where we started back then, and that's where it all started, how we broke it down. It's just a static view of the OODA loop in each domain. And if you remember, the dynamics of the OODA loop matter more than anything, of the Cynefin Framework matter more than anything else. You can imagine that with the OODA loop, you're going to change based on the context you're in. So if you're going through the full OODA loop, you're confused. And that's the whole idea there. If you think about the principle of least effort, as humans, we like to go through anything that has the least amount of effort. And therefore, if you look at the clear domain, the complicated domain, the complex domain, those are ideally suited based off the responses we have of probe, sense, respond, and so on within the Cynefin Framework. But anyway, it just was a happy accident. Dave and I did some work together in Quantico with some other folks in Mission Command, from some brilliant folks that really understand the OODA loop, and we really challenge each other. And we're still at this level, what you see now in the book. But I think when we went to Budapest last year in March, right before COVID hit, Dave recovered from his illness and saw things a little bit differently, and so did I. So there's some evolution that needs to happen from where we are in the book to where we need to go. But we have to ask ourselves, why is this important? And I'll just swing over here to this side of the screen. Many people talk about things like, this is the kill chain, sense, decide, act, right? It's the kill chain in the military. It's not that we want to do that everywhere, but when you think about sensing, we have a sensing component of the OODA loop, you have a decide component of the OODA loop, and you have an action side of it. So very useful in many things we do, from human machine teaming to how they developed Siri in the iPhone to big data. You find it everywhere, right? So we need to make sense of this. And I don't think you necessarily have to coach it to folks. I think you can use it as a framework to coach. And that's what I've been doing lately, is I start off with orientation and then show people how to make sense of their environment so they can act in it, show them how to plan effectively as teams, and show them how to separate their decisions from their outcomes. And that's the nice thing about the OODA loop. It has a lot of capability in it to really help us navigate how humans work together in teams, how machines work, where our strengths are as humans compared to machines or AI, and things like that. So there's a lot of depth to this that we haven't gotten to yet with the flow system. And that's what's amazing about the flow system. And I'm going to continue on here for a moment. The flow system is not about agile. I can care less about agility or agile. It's about a holistic view of the organization. How do we create a common language within an organization so we can have software developers and business folks work together and really understand what it is we're trying to do collectively, rather than have these islands of disconnected effort. And I think Ben understands that islands of disconnected effort is what John Boyd talked about as far as what we want to avoid in our organizations and the way we do business. So I'll leave it there, but looking forward to this conversation.
Okay, so we're about 20 minutes in, and I'm looking at the book because Punch did have the majority of the editorial and authorship in this, and he worked very close with John Turner on some of the literary and the peer-reviewed literature, which is cited in the book, including Boyd's own work, of course, and his own work was quite limited, which is a shame for us now. But I know, Andrew, you've been reading the book, and I'm interested to know what your thoughts are and your thoughts on how Punch has mapped Cynefin, and then everybody else sort of start to think about what they've seen and how Punch is mapping Cynefin. And then we can either do it on Punch's whiteboard, or we can use the Miro board we've got standing by, and I can bring the Miro board into the Zoom when appropriate. But I'm interested to learn comments from any of you about what Punch has done so far, challenges or issues you might have with that, or really to sort of go beyond where Punch is and give some thoughts around that. So I'm really going to open this. I'm going to invite Andrew if he's initially to give any comment, but this is really open now for everybody to start getting involved in discussion. And if I can think of anywhere PDCA fits, I might throw that in just for fun.
Yeah, sure. So I also have a flash copy of this book, which I recommend. What I was particularly interested in is there's a couple of things here. So I really loved how you'd mapped the different logic pathways and also the control loops to the different domains of Cynefin. What I'm interested in exploring today is a bit of the stuff that Chris has done on the domain transitions and how they might map back to what's been articulated in the way that you've looked at things. The other thing that I'm really interested in, so I'm doing a fair bit of work in terms of trying to work out how in remote and hybrid remote organizations we take strategy into planning, into execution, and then kind of close the gap on that cycle. We're using OKRs as a mechanism there because they're the mechanism of choice at the moment, and why go away from it? But what I tend to find with OKRs is that they push people into somewhat linear action logic, just due to the nature of how they're articulated. and they also don't fit with all operating models. So I think OKRs fit really nicely where you've got an operating model that is largely comprised of cross-functional teams. But in a lot of organizations, you're not working in that fashion, and sometimes it's not optimal in all chains of value to be working in that fashion anyway. So I'm interested in how the stuff that Ponch has done around the OODA action logic might assist us in thinking a bit differently about how we take strategy into delivery.
Chris, do you want to add anything on that? Because, I mean, Andrew referred to some of the work you've done. I don't know if it's a good moment for you to add, or whether or not we want to hear from Ponch or anybody else.
Yeah, I mean, I can just say that, you know, one of the reasons that it wasn't just my work by a long shot. You know, this was 3 of us. I mostly kicked everyone up the backside and said, let's get this done, otherwise known as facilitation. But yeah, essentially, I came up with a 3-dimensional representation of, and I like to call it a lens, Cynefin, because I think it's best used as a way of seeing the world rather than something to structure or scaffold or whatever. But I looked at it and I thought, you know, it's great kind of talking about workflows, and it's great talking about the context that we're in. But actually, if you want to understand something as people with stereoscopic vision and who live in a 3D world, if I could find a way to bring it into the 3D world so that you could appreciate the energy expenditure of moving between contexts and so forth, it makes a lot of sense. And as somebody who is terrified of heights and still does rock climbing, I'm extremely familiar with the fear of falling off a cliff, which is definitely the complacency-induced catastrophic failure element of you know, Cynefin. So putting that into 3D really makes it, you understand why it's such an energy cost to fall off that cliff and why it's so damaging. You know, there's no failure, there's only feedback, but sometimes feedback's terminal. That's just how it works. So yeah, and so that's kind of why I had a look at that. And it was also with Martin Berg and Rob England from Teal Unicorn, who's down in New Zealand. And so we kind of combined our kind of, you know, really cool, it was kind of a cartoony trolley kind of way of looking at it. So it was quite fun and engaging. We had all of Rob's work around workflows around that. And then I kind of provided the other things. And I'm going to be very pleased at the fact that I proved Dave wrong when he said that, I know it doesn't happen very often, but he said you can't put liminality into 3D, and we did. And I said, ha, and kind of left it at that. So
for the benefit of the audience, we're talking about Dave Snowden here, our nearest and dearest friend, who will probably be invited to future sessions as we expand on this topic, because this 1 hour is not going to be sufficient, that's for sure. Ponch, you've heard a bit from Andrew there and a little bit from Chris. Do you want to sort of scribble a few things and talk about what you did in the book?
Yeah, I do. And I want to invite Ben into this here in a moment, but a couple things stuck out here. Number one, fear, that's going to be our orientation. And I think if you're going to study anything in the OODA loop, just focus on orientation, right? Boyd didn't cover everything. He covered 5 components in there. I'm not going to be able to rattle them off right now, but cultural, our genetic heritage, cultural, I forgot the other one, help me out there. Synthesis, analysis, previous experience, and a few other things. So if you think about the way Dave talks about the unavoidable realities of being human, that's orientation. That's who we are, right? We're always trying to improve that orientation. So fear pops out there. So if there's anything to do, really focus on the humanness or the human factor side of the OODA loop. And I saw a post recently from Alistair Coburn who said, you know, the OODA loop's great, except for it doesn't account for the human side of things. And I'm like, you don't understand the OODA loop now, do you? So orientation is key, absolutely key in everything we do. Next thing, mission command and OKRs. I had an interesting conversation with Don Vandergriff, who I would say is the expert on mission command here in the US. And I said, hey, Don, I'm looking at OKRs and all I see is mission command. He's like, yeah, they're the same thing. So if you think about mission command and you look back at where Boyd pulled a lot of his ideas for the OODA loop, it actually came from mission command. And mission command is what we call implicit guidance control. It should be implied on how we come up with our OKRs. And again, it does change based off of context. And was it Christopher or Andrew that pointed out that OKRs are good in linear environments? I can't remember who said that, but anyway,
It was Andrew.
I agree with you.
Yeah, and it's
Yeah,
the
Andrew.
flavour of the month at the moment.
Yeah,
It'll go
yeah.
away, hopefully.
Yeah, so I feel the same way. And one of the things I learned about, the direction of travel in the complex domain, running your experiments or running your probes, that's all you need to do. Did you run an experiment? Did you learn? Hey, there you go. That's a great OKR for the complex domain, right? You don't need to get any more specific than that. So Ben, I'm going to throw it over to you. What are your thoughts on what I just said, or what can you add to this?
Yeah, so OKRs, they've suffered, like so many other great ideas, that they've been consulted to death, right? And they've lost their original essence. Like my favorite quote from Andy Grove's book is, first let chaos reign and then reign in chaos. And that's not how consultants work, right? They don't like chaos at all, so they pretend it doesn't exist. So we've ended up with a very watered down, linear, and much less useful version of OKRs. I agree that the intent is that they should be, implementing mission command in big companies. I think one of the areas that something that Chris mentioned that I think is definitely worth digging into is this of dimensions. So I've just finished the first science fiction that I've read for quite a long time. It was the three-body problem. And one of the things I've chucked into the Miro is a quote. Is a quote from the book that literally made me stop and stare. And it's about when we get when the solar system gets attacked by the aliens and they collapse us down into 2 dimensions. And the description here is that that you have to lay out the whole of your 3 dimensions into 2 dimensions, and grandeur collapses down into complexity. And I think that's what we do so much when we try and linearize plans, we try and control the uncontrollable, we collapse our grandeur down into complexity. And that's what so much of we're ice skating uphill because we're looking at things in the wrong dimensions. And I think the OODA loop is, when you understand the essence of it, which is definitely not the little diagram with the 4 dots on it, the circle, I think it still fits, but I really think it's got a representation problem that I'd love us to dig into a bit further.
Yeah,
Kim, I was going to invite Kim just in because she's obviously a sci-fi fan like me, which is good. But I want to get into drawing some of these diagrams as well. So Kim, I want to get your thoughts and feelings so we can start to get into the visualization of this and keep the audience engaged.
So one of the things we haven't really touched on, one of the reasons I came up with the easy analysis can of worms equivalents to clear and then complicated and complex was to make it easy for people to use. And it's helping people to explain and articulate how much of the subcomponents of a piece of work actually live in the complex domain. I was horrified. The first time I did something similar, I had a 200 project program with 7 project program leads. And I got them to just fill in a 2-column thing about, what level of uncertainty is there here? Do you know what to build or what to do? And are you 100% confident it will achieve the outcome? And only if they said yes in both columns did I count it as having high certainty. Everything else had a level of complexity in it. And out of 200, only 6 of them had yes in both columns. And I was horrified and shocked. It's like, I didn't think there was that much complexity in our world, but there is. And I went to Dave and I said, oh, I'm a bit worried, only 3% live on the right-hand side of the Cynefin Framework. He goes, yeah, that's about right. When I facilitate that sort of stuff, it's usually 1%. I'm like, oh. And then when I did the report back, I said less than 30% of our work is using the appropriate approaches, which are of course high certainty ones, because I think saying 3% would have been a career limiting move at the time. So that, to me, that's one of the reasons why even good old Taylor, I'm a big fan of Taylor, Frederick Winslow Taylor, he was misinterpreted. His original intent is the roots of lean. There you go. Yes, exactly. The principles of scientific management. Everyone blames him for command and control, but it's how people have interpreted it. So even whatever we come up with today will be misinterpreted at some point. And in 100 years' time, people will go, oh, those darn people that came up with this OODA Cynefin thingy, you know, they're the problem. No, it's people's understanding. And Ponch, what you said about, yeah, in complexity, you just have to run experiments. And did you run an experiment and did you learn? That sounds so simple. People don't think it's work.
There's a lot I'd love to dig. I want to say there's something I'd really love to dig into, because I've been doing an experiment recently where asking people, do they think they're in the predictable world or unpredictable world, using Cynefin as a background with some descriptions and some anonymous dot voting, you know, sort of a semi-sense making exercise. And you're getting about 50 to 70% of the people, and even in one extreme case, 80% of the people say they're in the unpredictable world. Yet they're all using project management techniques and good old linear causality sort of tools. And I'm going, well, either you don't understand the work or you're using the wrong tools. It's one or the other, which is exactly what you just said. So I find that fascinating. We'll save that for another session. Ponch, I forgot what Andrew asked you a few minutes ago. So Andrew, just recenter us so Ponch can do something with a pen.
Yeah, I think what Kim said is really interesting to me. So I think the main decisions that you make in any organizational context are economic decisions. The top of the economic decision equation is how much value are we creating. The bottom of the economic equation is how much is it going to cost us. And people treat that equation like it's simple all the time. Whereas in reality, it is very rare that we can exactly predict how much value we're going to get from something. It's even rarer that we understand how much work there is and the true nature of the dependency chains that we're going to need to use, both internal and with our supply chains, to execute on things. So what I'm interested in is if we say that, all right, there's your core economic decision, and part of taking strategy into delivery is answering that question using contextually appropriate techniques. How can OODA help us to, and the mapping of OODA to Cynefin help us navigate those core decisions?
That's a tough one. I'm gonna try this real fast. Okay, so two components here. You brought up how much value, which is going to be determined by whom, that's in my view, it's the customer. Nigel, thoughts?
Yeah, from my perspective, only the customer can determine the value you're delivering.
And then how much cost, that's going to be the system, and then the external environment and the internal environment. So I'm going to throw out something that I learned from going to the archives, and then Boyd looked at a lot in the Toyota production system. And he said that over here, control, which is your value, is outside and bottom up, right? It's outside and bottom up. And then command, which is leadership, is top down, inside out. Right. So think about that. That's your organization has to figure out this, and somehow we have to figure out the outside in, the control side, the outside in, bottom up. So potentially that's one way to look at it, is your values can be determined by your outside in, your customer, and that's how the OODA loop is set up right now. And then mission command and the implicit guidance and control gives us that ability to understand what are our internal costs and then what are the costs of the external environment. So I don't know if that's going to get to that answer, but that's what popped up the top of my head when you brought that up, the equation. Ben, you were shaking your head, Ben. What do you think?
No, I was nodding. I was so I've found for my own thinking that splitting the OODA loop up into situational awareness and the action side has been helpful. So observe and orient is basically maps almost exactly onto the research that Misha Endersley did in the US Air Force on situational awareness. So that you can overlay them and they look exactly the same. They even use the same words for some stuff, even though there wasn't much evidence of any collaboration. So I've started thinking of OODA as a hierarchy, right? So your bottom up is your control, right? It's your observation. which feeds into your orientation, and how familiar what you observe is or appears to be determines how far up the hierarchy or how far in the hierarchy you go, right? How much perturbation of your internal state you need to be able to figure out a response. And then the decide and act part is definitely, I mean, you know, command and control, there's still command in decentralized organizations, right? You still need some shared understanding of where you're going. So that is, I don't know, I've been playing with you know, operational excellence, or you know, empowered execution, or you know, some of the other stuff that's in various different parts of literature. Ponch is laughing at me. So that's how I'm like, if I was to pull apart, and you know, if I was to do a snowmobile exercise on the OODA loop diagram itself, I would have it as a concentric circle. I would have it all be about orientation, and there'd be you know, some sort of thermodynamic boundary between the entity and the outside world.
Ben, I want to build on this because I talked to John and Nigel about this about a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, and I said we were working on situational awareness. And I don't want to take us too far off of this, but 3 levels of situational awareness. Simple way to explain it: what happened, what happened, what's happening, and then what could happen in the future. So if you look at the OODA loop, remember you got 2 feedback loops that go from your action into the environment. What happened? What happened is critical in debriefing. I don't care about your attitudes and beliefs. I want to know what happened. We want that accountability, right? So that's how we build level 1 SA, is through effective reflection of what happened. And this goes back to inattentional blindness. In many ways, we can coach people and train people that why it's so important to understand what happened, because now we can get into SA2, what's happening, you know, kind of that sense-making piece of what's happening. I got these backwards. SA2 over here on the left, what's happening, and SA3, what could happen in the future, the anticipatory thinking. So when you map recognition prime decision-making, which I started to do with Gary Klein, here's a fantastic connection, and I haven't done any work on this in a year and a half, but so we're getting into some other advanced thinking here. RPD, naturalistic decision-making, autonomic responses and all that, the simulation you do in your head is already built into the OODA loop. So it's a fantastic way to overlap this and gets into the neuroscience you were talking about, Ben. And I'm sorry to deviate on this, but I want to go there because Ben brought us here. This is fantastic. But there's a strong connection here between Gary Klein, resilience engineering from Dr. David Woods, and you guys need to know this is critical because resilience engineering feeds into DevOps and all that as well. But the person that works for Gary Klein and helped on RPD and NDM, naturalistic decision-making, is the same person that wrote Maneuver Warfare Doctrine for the Marine Corps, Major John Schmidt. So if you want to talk about some massive connections here, we've got Dave Snowden, Gary Klein, David Woods, these guys work together. We got John Schmidt. There's all this massive thinking coming together that we need to explore. And I think we're going to be able to help folks with the AI, ML, this new thing we're going into at the fourth, industrial revolution. And that's why we need to go deeper into this. It's not about one thing. I think it's pretty universal, and it's not a panacea, but we get an opportunity to really help organizations understand what we're facing, not only as as humans. I'll just leave it at that. Thoughts?
Well,
sorry, I didn't want
to. I'm sorry, Ponch. I was going to jump in because I want to pick up something Ben was saying, and it sort of segues a bit to what Kim was saying about people thinking Taylorism is all command and control, but then the fact we need command and control when we're in a chaotic environment. Somebody needs to step forward and lead, or do something, otherwise bad things will happen. If the plane, no, not the plane analogy, but if something bad's happening, you want somebody to take control. And just as a aside for you, Kim, Toyota's production system has more to thank Taylor for than most other things, funnily enough. A lot of people don't like that, but it's factual. But let's look at the OODA loop, Ponch, and I keep zooming in on you because you've got the whiteboard, but if we look at the 5 domains of the OODA loop, we ignore the one in the middle from aporia, confusion, disorder, and everything. We just sort of look at the 4, the 2 on the ordered side and the 2 on the unordered side or unpredictable side, and we drop into that area of chaos. Because I'm looking at the work that you did, where we've got the chaotic domain, which is accents respond. where we might need some command and control. And then you put the OODA loop in there, and you call it the chaotic loop, of course, here. And this is where we sort of have observe and orient, but there's no decision there at all in that particular loop. And you describe this as, if I'm reading this correctly, in the chaotic loop, however, one begins with acting rather than beginning with observing, as in the clear and complicated loops. The feedback and feed forward mechanisms are also different because of the change in the initial starting condition. So I just wondered whether it was worthwhile just talking about, because people who are familiar with the OODA loop will probably be listening to this, otherwise they just happened on it randomly on YouTube following some recommendation about cats that laugh or people falling off motorcycles. But we've got the OODA loop, the observe, orient, decide, and act. And when we look at the chaotic loop, for instance, in the act, sense, respond domain of Cynefin, we see observe, orient, act. We don't have the decision box because we start with act, then we observe and we orient. So I just wanted to dig into a little bit of understanding of that, because I'm sure with the conversations with the people we have here, we can then wander into complexity where we see the full OODA loop. And then we can unpick probably at another session, we can probably start to unpick something on the predictable side. And Chris, I see you've unmuted, so I'm going to be quiet.
So on the first part in the chaotic domain, the example I usually give is in aviation. We act, sense, respond, right? The way we do it is heavy command and control. Brake right, muzzle flash, left 9 o'clock, right? If I do it the other way, hey, look, a muzzle flash over there on my left 9 o'clock, I'm dead, right? So we act first. We want to be directive over descriptive. Do something, let's make sense of it, see if it's still tracking on us, get us into another domain as fast as humanly possible so we can maneuver, right? So that's that piece there. The other piece is the one that goes into the diamond, the decision-making step. If you see that missing, that means we're going through the implicit guidance and control pathway that goes from orient to act. That's a good thing in some domains, right? Because we know how to, or what to do or how to do it as a team. In the complex domain on the technical side, chances are we need to go through that hypothesis. We don't know how to do this technical thing. So we got to run some experiments. And by the way, the diamond inside the OODA loop is decide and hypothesis, right? So that you got to test something out there. So you do have an opportunity, and I call it the complicated domain. It's a high performance team domain. If you don't have to, if you're trying to figure out how to work together all the time with your team, you're running through a complex OODA loop, right? Because you got to figure out how are we going to do this? How are we going to decide things? If you know how to work, if it's muscle memory, it's intuitive, you just know how to do it, you increase the flow of information within the team. That's the complicated OODA loop that we have in the complicated domain. And that goes to the implicit guidance and control pathway where mission command exists, your mental models, your repertoire, your shared schema, how we work together as teams, right? That needs to be there. So this is a huge thing to look at. Is if you're going through the whole OODA loop, you're confused, right? You just don't know what's going on, and that's a high energy approach to trying to figure things out. Did that answer the question, Nigel? Is that what you wanted?
Yeah, I think it's taken us a little way, because when I'm observing it, and I want to pass this over to Chris because I can see he wants to, he's got a commentary to add that's better than mine. But when I look at the difference between the chaotic and the clear loops that you designed and drew in the book, they're almost, you have to look, take it a second glance, because they're almost, and I apologize for not having the graphics in this. For our next session, I'll get all the images and we can flash these up. And I was just looking at the Miro board, but we don't have the book images on there, so I'll make those available for the next session, so we've got those. But when I look at the chaotic and the clear loop, there's a very subtle difference, because in the chaotic loop, you're starting with act. But in the clear loop, if I'm right here, you're starting with orient. Am I right there? Am I wrong?
That's a great question, because if you think about autonomic responses, if it's just muscle memory, we see something, respond to it. So it goes back to our previous experience and right out through the implicit guidance and control pathway to action. That's all we're doing. We see something, we just know how to react to it, we act, right? So I don't know if you start in the orient there, but it needs to go through orientation. Otherwise, it's got to match something, right? Some pattern matching needs to happen.
But I mean, if you're in an ordered domain and it's familiar to you, then you don't really need to orient because you're already oriented, right? You've already got that kind of alignment, if you like. So
right. So it goes right. Observe. It goes right to your muscle memory, which is part of your orientation, right? We want the Cynefin framework to be part of our orientation, right? We don't want to have to think about it. We want it muscle memory. And as soon as we can make something muscle memory, and I'm talking about muscle memory in the brain, it flows from. It's the fastest way to go through the OODA loop.
So like domain proprioception, if you like.
Yeah, exactly.
Kim,
But so Sonia and I had this conversation. She said, why can't we pass the orientation step in here? I said, because if we don't have orientation, it determines how we decide and act, right? So it's what's in us, what do we know as humans, determines how we observe and decide and act.
Can I just build on that very briefly?
Yeah.
So I actually think the OODA loop should always start from ACT, because so a lot of the neuroscience books I've read, so Surfing Complexity, I haven't actually read the book, I've read a summary, but it's sort of in line with many other things I've read in 1,000 Brains recently. They both make the point that our orientation is built through action first, right? We don't have cognition without action. Even our eyes can't see unless they're moving, right? We think we see a static world, but we actually don't. So our orientation is the result of mental models and abstractions and hierarchical kind of structures that have always been built through action first. So even though I agree, Ponch, that when you have that instant muscle memory reaction, you are skimming very thinly through orient. That orientation itself has been built through the result of action and observation over time.
Right. So we're going through the OODA loop many times, a million times a second, right? So where we start, it's a chicken and egg thing, right? So I kind of agree with you, but it's not one OODA loop, right? It's thousands
multiple
per second.
Multiple intersecting ones.
Yeah. And then as we go through the domains of the Cynefin framework, that's exponential, right? We're just flying through so many darn OODA loops. And think about this: the way we sense things right now, there's so many OODA loops happening around us at this moment. And I mean, this is critical. And you think about the misinformation, disinformation that's happening. This is what you want to do, is you want to inject that into somebody's OODA loop or anybody's OODA loop to create some confusion within it. And if you do that successfully, fifth generation warfare, which I know Ben looked at with liminal, or I forget the name of the book, but the liminality and liminal warfare, that's really what's happening here. So again, we're taking it to another level, but I agree with you, Ben, because we are going through thousands of OODA loops, and remember, just take a static view of the OODA loop per domain. Yeah.
I'm just.
So I guess. Sorry, Kim.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I just had a question. Have we reflected the speed of the OODA loop cycles on the Cynefin framework? Because I'm thinking in the chaotic domain, they have to be super fast. In the clear domain, they can be super fast, but they don't have to be super fast, using technical terms. In the complicated domain, they necessarily might be slower because you're generally working in domain of expertise and you're having to coordinate with other people. And in complexity, you might go quite slowly through observe and orient because, it takes a while to test your hypotheses and things like that before you can actually get to deciding. So have we reflected the speed of the cycles in the different domains?
So going back to the original question about strategy to task, think about it as nested OODA loops, nested Cynefin frameworks, if you will. So if you have a cadence in an organization, your OODA loop at your strategy may be a little bit slower than at the tactical level, right? Now, there's another aspect to this, and I'll ask Ben to amplify this a little bit. Two huge components of the OODA loop that people kind of forget. One is speed, the other one's tempo. And if you can control the tempo of something, you dominate, right? So and this is something I still have to work on to really understand. And I don't know, I don't want to throw Ben under the bus, but Ben, do you have a good explanation between the two, or it might, between speed and tempo?
So I think Chris is going to have some interesting insights in this. I think this is where the martial arts angle comes in heavily. Okay. Right? So when I roll with a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, It doesn't last very long for a start. So the speed the speed thing is a thing, but the tempo, like the fastest I can get through my OODA loop is not even enough to tax I can't say that word. Chris, what was it again?
Proprioception.
Proprioception. It doesn't even, it doesn't even drop somebody who's been practicing for years into any of the deeper levels of the OODA loop at all, right? They're just working on surface level, pure intuition. Nothing I do will cause any kind of confusion. So the tempo and the fast transients that Boyd talks about is what his ability, or her, in fact. I can roll with a woman who's half the weight of me who can do this to me. It's that the tempo changes that they can generate because they're thinking so many steps ahead. So that's the difference between speed and tempo. It's the changes. Like I can expect that I'm in a really decent position, and then before I know it, the game's changed and I didn't even see it coming.
Yeah.
Whereas speed is just this, like, you do, I do, you do, I do, which is where many traditional martial arts absolutely fall down because they practice like this. And then you get some skinhead in a pub at 11 o'clock at night who's in your face like this before you even know it. And then your nose is broken and you're in hospital.
Then you realize he's holding a glass ashtray and you're like, I'm pretty sure I didn't see one of these in the dojo or whatever. But no, but I think that's right, because you start getting to the point where when it's kind of an autonomous response as to which of these loops you're noticing the repetition of loops. So you're kind of autonomously deciding which one's the most valid for your context, like which of the repetitions are amplified enough to be of the most use to you. But if you're doing it kind of autonomously, you're not even, like Ben said, you're not thinking about it. So the context or path switching at that point, and this goes back to how humans do everything. Basically, we learn all the stuff about how you learn is actually mostly about how you engage, and really what you're doing is creating neural connections in response to stimulus. And the more of those you have, the faster you are reacting. If it's within your motor cortex, you are essentially creating muscle memory. Muscle memory doesn't sit in your muscles, it sits in your brain. So you are creating these loops with concurrent connections, right? So that's what amplifies these loops to be so, like, super fast, if you like. I'm just literally throwing stuff out here. I could be wrong, but
no, I think that's spot on. I think actually the bit about the muscle memory, I think, is critical, because the way I see it is you're building abstractions, right? They can be physical abstractions, i.e. I move this way and I topple someone's balance, or they can be, mental abstractions of, oh, this is a warning sign that is tickling my intuition about a project that's going wrong. But they are chunked representations of the world that allow you to work at a higher level. So, my jiu-jitsu instructor is operating in the clear domain, doing exactly the same thing that I'm operating in the complex or chaotic domain. And in fact, they possess the ability to tip me from complex into chaotic at any point. And that's the key with the tempo stuff.
And
I know Andrew wants to come in.
Andrew. Yeah, so time in organizations I find fascinating because, and I also find perspective fascinating. So your strategy cycle is inexorably linked to your delivery cycle. If you've got short delivery cycle times, you can have short strategy cycles. So if I'm delivering on a 2-weekly cadence, then a quarterly cadence for strategy is probably something that makes sense, because I can take strategy into delivery and I can see the full cycle before I make more decisions. But not all parts of an organization are going to be able to act like that. If I'm building a mega battery, or if I'm building like generation capability, or if I'm building a new telco tech that I'm then going to roll out, my lead times for that sort of work are necessarily longer. So my strategy cycle has to be longer for that stuff. So I'm really fascinated by how that kind of maps up. And then I think I think it was Kim that taught me, which Ben summed up beautifully just then, is that Cynefin is about perspectives. So what I feel to be complex is not necessarily, like, to me, aspects of this conversation are going to be far more complex than aspects of to other people in the room. And it's how at a strategy level you can find the right time to bring in the expertise to change the perspective on a problem that I find fascinating as well.
I want to pick up on that briefly. I mean, I know we're getting close to the hour, but we can do a quick vote whether we want to continue for 5 or 10, or we will adjourn to the next session. But
5 or 10 hours.
Pardon?
5 or 10 hours.
Yeah, we could go all night. This is gonna be fun.
Well, time is perceptual, so there you go.
Totally.
But
Just let me go and heat some sake up and we'll be good.
there's a time. It's usually Blaney who needs to get off early because he's busy being important. But it's coming to the end of my day here in the UK. You don't care, and the sun's coming up beautifully behind Kim, so she's waiting to start her day. But there's a couple of things I want to pick up on. Speed's a really critical thing, because when people look at the OODA loop, they think of Boyd, 40-second Boyd, quick kills, bang, 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 think, and defeat. But that's the whole point. Is I'm wondering whether or not the OODA loop is defining behavior, because Cynefin is this sense-making framework. It allows us to know where we are, and the things that Kim said a few minutes ago were fascinating, and the way she's interpreted it. And I saw the sort of can of worms quote I think you've done online before, and that was brilliant. But just because something is difficult doesn't make it complex. But the problem is, it's your perception as an individual, or maybe a group of individuals who are cognitively biased in some way, that think it's complex. It's like the exercise I do with Cynefin, where I tell the people, do you think your environment or the work you're doing is unpredictable and unordered and non-linear, or is it linear, ordered, and predictable? And half the people vote on the unpredictable side. But that's because the majority of them don't actually understand the work, and they're using the wrong tools, as I mentioned earlier. But predominantly it's they don't understand the work. They just haven't got the skills, the training, the knowledge to be able to pick through it. And it's actually difficult. It's not really complex. It belongs in the ordered world, using the right tools when you actually understand the work you're doing. So my point here is the OODA loop, and this is exactly what Andrew was saying, the OODA loop may be really slow in some strategic decision making and some execution of strategy in an organization. But does that make it then invalid, or is everybody seeing the OODA loop as some manic, rapid, brain-firing decision-making? Because like the martial artists we're talking about, and again, I keep looking at Chris's swords, and I'm glad he's in a different country than me, but the thing is this, that if you're in a bar fight, you got to think quick. If some madness is going off, riots and other things, you got to think quick and act. This is not the time to think, oh, let me go through my kata that I was taught by my karate master, because that's just nonsense. You're going to be down on the floor before you even get the first thought out. So in that situation, the OODA loop and the way, and you can talk about where you start the OODA loop, but the OODA loop happens real fast. But then if you get into the organizational context, that hypothesis that's in that decide thing can take days, weeks, months. It just depends on the contextual situation you find yourself in. So I want to throw those out as a few ideas, and we can go a few minutes longer if everybody's good. Yeah. And then we'll find where we're in a happy place. I have uploaded all the imagery to the Miro board. So our next session, I think we can dig into the actual visuals and start talking about the component parts, because I definitely think a second session is going to happen here, guys. But anyway, based on speed, and things like Chris, you're ready to come back on some of that. So I'll let you
I just had a couple of things that I wanted to mention. So something very interesting happened to me once many years ago when I was doing some Kung Fu. I didn't get particularly high in Kung Fu. I love traditional martial arts and how they work, but they are very context specific in terms of viability. Let's put it that way. So
that's an incredibly diplomatic way to put it, Chris.
Yeah. Once you go somewhere and a bunch of guys twice your weight trap you between their legs in a pair of shorts and throw you around in Greco-Roman wrestling, you start realizing that yes, perhaps being a kung fu master doesn't make you invulnerable. But anyway, I remember once I was doing some training in some Wing Chun. I wasn't very good with Wing Chun because all I got was too much karate, because I'm quite physical and it's not necessarily designed for that. But I was kind of just doing some basic stuff with this guy who was a brown sash, and he'd been going, and he'd earned the brown sash by going constantly, over time as these things happen. And he got very upset because I said, well, I've got to be honest, what you're doing, I really want to kind of arm lock you. And he said, oh, well, try. And so I did, and I arm locked him just because I'm used to it. I have fast reflexes and I'm whatever. And eventually he got very upset, and he said to me, well, yes, but he said, you're not doing this right. You're not meant to use other martial arts. And Wing Chun was developed to be used against people who've never used martial arts. And I said, well, number one, no, it wasn't. But number two, you're using something in a very oddly specific way. Like, what are you using this for? And I was trying to probe the why, and of course he didn't want to know about the why because he was upset, and we kind of left it there. But the other thing as well that I came kind of popped into my mind while I was listening to a lot of what you guys were saying was the problem with a lens is that it is always used subjectively. And I think that that's something that I've literally just thought of, and I'm going to think about quite a bit more. Because I think that you're exactly right. Anything that you look at, you are by necessity looking at it from your point of view. And so when you use something that is a lens, because it has a breadth and a depth that you can view things to in different granularities, you are still going to be interpreting them, relative to yourself. So I think that that's where, distributed cognition and that kind of thing, the wisdom of the crowds comes in to be very useful, as Dave says.
Yeah. Can I just offer a slight build on that in terms of the OODA loop? So this is the most incredible thing to me about Boyd's work, is that Boyd actually thought about both of these things, right? He thought of this in the context of the OODA loop with Gödel's incompleteness theorem and Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. So the uncertainty principle is about the fidelity with which you can measure your environment, so your sampling speed. And then the incompleteness theorem, I'm going to butcher this because I'm not trained in formal logic, but essentially the way I interpret this is that there's always another point of view, right? There's always an external perspective you can take from within a system. You can take the perspective from within a system, but there's always a bigger system that you can step out of ad infinitum. And sometimes you have to do that. If you're seeing things that are happening too fast, or things that don't have consistent logic, then you either need to sample quicker, or you need to step outside of the system, the frame of reference that you're looking at, and look at it from a bigger point of view.
It's hard to navigate when you're too close to the sun, is usually how I put it, because I'm a fantasy author. Nice. And I can't help it.
Well, yeah, I'm reading what Boyd said, and we'll show this in full in our next session because it's in his own words from a speech he gave, The Essence of Winning and Losing, on 28th of June 1995 for context, also known as The Big Squeeze. But I'm just going to use a little bit of it. He says, without a many-sided implicit cross-referencing process of projection, empathy, correlation, and rejection, and I'm going to skip the bit in parentheses, we cannot even do analysis and synthesis. Without OODA loops, we can neither sense, hence observe, thereby collect a variety of information for the above processes, nor decide as well as implement actions in accord with these processes. And he went on to say, without OODA loops embracing all of the above, and without the ability to get inside other OODA loops, which Ponch talks about a whole amount of times, or what is paraphrased as other environments, we will find it impossible to comprehend, shape, adapt to, and in turn be shaped by an unfolding, evolving reality that is uncertain, ever-changing, and unpredictable. Very few words that make a hell of a lot of sense.
Yeah. Hey, I want to throw one thing out there, and this I threw it up behind me. So I brought this up. Remember, OODA loop is also built on the second law of thermodynamics, early flow thinking as well. And when you look at what defines a flow system, it has inlets, outlets, or an outlet and a boundary, right? And that's it. So the OODA loop has an inlet, actually has three, has outlets, right? So to me, if you think about a flow system, it's a great way to represent one, because what we're trying to do is increase the flow of whatever currency it is through that system. And that's it. So when you get into constructal law, other things, and I haven't spent a lot of time on this lately, I've been too busy consulting, but there's so many levels we can take this to. And that's why I totally enjoy working with this. And I also think that you don't need to coach and train folks on the OODA loop. It's not necessary. But you can design your courses around it, right? And you can design things, and at the end of the course go, by the way, I just took you through an OODA loop. Here it is. I took you through inattentional blindness. I took you through the unavoidable realities that make us human. I gave you ways to make sense of your environment as a team. I gave you SenseMaker as a tool. I gave you narrative. I showed you all these things, including Wardley maps, to make sure we build that situational awareness. I showed you ways on how to build high-performing teams to make that implicit guidance control pathway work for you, and how to separate your decisions from outcomes when you do effective debriefing. Congratulations, you're now a high-performing team if you execute properly. So something else, and I love talking about this, but two things. When we talk about performance or effectiveness in organizations, The simple way to think about it is you have the task work and the teamwork, right? So you have two different types of OODA loops working in parallel. If your teamwork OODA loop is blocked because you're going through the high energy approach where you don't know how to work together as a team, that takes energy away from you, right? It's, our brains burn 20% of our calories. 2% of our body weight does that. We want to be highly, we're lazy creatures by design. So we want to create that teaming capability. And this is what we're really trying, in my opinion, what we're trying to do with the flow system and teamwork is build that teaming capability, that teaming OODA loop as fast as humanly possible. So when we do find technical challenges, it's the teamwork that allows us to solve it with the technical side. If you're too busy focused on how you work together as a team and you just don't know how to do that, you're taking energy away from your real problem. So again, there's many ways to look at the OODA loop, but that's just another way for me to explain it to folks as a flow system.
So I'm going to bring us gently towards the close of this, but Kim, I want to come to you and see some last thoughts from you. We've heard from the three OODA guys there, but because I don't think Blaney and myself are OODA guys. But Kim, let's get some thoughts from you to finish session 1, and I will send out the doodle to get us into a session 2 when we can look at the diagrams and dissect those in more detail and some of the work in the book and some of Andrew's comments and things. So Kim.
Yeah, just picking up on the everything that we do and everything that we observe is subjective. I said it took me 3 months to figure out that the Cynefin framework was a sense-making tool and a checking tool. It took me 3 years to figure out that it was more powerful as a subjective lens rather than trying to get everyone to agree that something went in one domain. So I think that's a really important element that we need to consider in our next conversation is the subjectiveness and how Cynefin and the OODA loops are impacted by the subjectiveness of the observation.
I'm writing that down because that's really good. So we'll make sure that's the topic to kick us off with. And I've seen lots of people doing work on the Miro to give us the canvas we can share with everybody of our discussions. Andrew, I gave you the first word. I'm going to give you the last word.
Glad I'm not an OODA guy. It doesn't sound particularly comfortable. Yeah, look, I think I've just been kind of taking down some notes here as people have been talking. I don't know that I've got anything to add at the moment. I need to really digest a bit of the stuff that's been said, but it kind of feels to me that there's definitely something that we can do here to stitch strategic thinking together with Cynefin and OODA and work out mechanisms that we can use to make that stuff flow through an organization. I'm very interested in seeing where that goes.
No, I think that's a great way to leave it. I think everybody's got their heads full of great ideas. I'll send out a poll to schedule the next session in the coming week or so. The Miro's updated. Feel free to throw anything on that might be used from the next session, and we'll do more activity looking at the imagery and the graphics and discuss something around there. But I am very keen to discuss more about Cynefin, the subjectiveness of that, or how it should be used versus how people think it should be used. And as you say, Andrew, the strategic aspect of it, how we can use the OODA loop type approach in strategic thinking, aligned with these other tools we've got to help navigate complexity and get us away from the agile echo chamber. To all my friends on this call, I am really grateful to you. We'll end it there. I'm going to stop the recording now. Bear with me 1 second.